About 12 years ago, I got involved in an increasing amount of research at the University of Otago in Dunedin. I got invited to be part of the faculty, and one of the questions that was asked of me were what are some of the things in a rural community that I was observing that would be a good research program or indicated issues of risk for injuries in a rural population. So thinking back on the 24 years of observations I'd made in my community, one of the things I had actually noticed in that 24 odd years was that certain occupational groups, and classically in South Otago, similar to what happens here in Australia, that both farmers and farm-related workers, contractors, had a high risk of back pain and a high risk of musculoskeletal injuries. And looking for an initial topic to research and review, I recalled what I had been seeing with shearers. And one of my basic observations was that if I got together with a bunch of my friends in my community, the farmers and farm contractors, the shearers, and if we classically had a bottle of Spates or a bottle of Foster's in our hand or a bottle of Carlton, after a while, when we're socially standing, talking, that a particular occupational group would demonstrate more and more discomfort from prolonged standing. And that seemed to be most predominantly shearers. That after a while, in a social environment, instead of standing, there was a tendency for these guys to want to stand in this position. And that was both, I was seeing it both clinically in my clinical environment as a physiotherapist, and I was seeing it socially. So that started my research program in shearers. And so to cut a long story short, we got a group of 64 shearers and we investigated them for side-on posture and side-on flexibility, and we compared them to 64 non-shearers. And we looked to see what changes there were in this occupational group compared to a group of non-shearers. And we hypothesised, or we argued, that shearers would, not surprisingly, that shearers would gain increased mobility this way compared to the normal population. They would lose mobility this way compared to the normal population. And we hypothesised that they would also have adaptive standing posture based on the physical demands of their job. And we also argued that those changes, if they did occur, would probably be linked to back pain. So we investigated these movement parameters in shearers and compared them against non-shearers, and we found that what we hypothesised was correct. The shearers gained about 24% more ability to bend forward than the non-shearing population. And surprise, surprise, it came from the hip. Shearers gained a marked amount of increased flexibility forward. Most of them could put their hands on the floor. And a 24% increase, and that was essentially an increase of movement about the hip. Then we examined the ability of the shearers to arch backwards in a freestanding position, and we actually measured a 37% reduction in the ability of shearers to lean backwards in comparison to a non-shearing population. And that loss of movement leaning backwards did not occur at the hip. It occurred at the low back or the lumbar spine. And we also observed that shearers showed subtle but significant changes in posture. And these were shearers whose average age, 64 shearers with an average age of about 32, ranging all the way from 19 to 59. And the trend was there, and it was evident from within 5 years of being a shearer, that they were showing adaptive changes to both movement and posture in their spine and hips associated with just being a shearer. So the next question we asked was, did these adaptive changes then show a link to back pain? And interestingly, even though we could split the shearers out to 33 shearers who had back pain that had required clinical treatment and 31 that hadn't, there was no link between back pain and adaptive posture. So the postural changes and the movement changes that were being seen, which were strongly evident in the shearing population, did not seem to show a link directly to back pain. However, the one qualifier was that this is an occupational group that shows substantially increased risk of back injury anyway. So there still may be a link with back pain, we're not fully certain, but there is certainly a strong evidence that shearers adapt to the job. And possibly therefore, or probably therefore, my initial observations that in a social environment where a lot of rural people who have physically demanding bent forward positions stand in this position socially because that becomes a more comfortable position to be in, we would strongly argue that that was evident. So we could summarise that in a simple answer by saying, put your head down for long periods of time, stick your ass up in the air for long periods of time, and you're going to adapt to that job. And there is probably a link, we're still exploring it further, to this increased risk of back pain in that occupation. And there are some things we feel that shearers can do in order to try and minimise that risk.